transformation. And if it were not for Horan, perhaps I would have been content to live out my days in the embrace of all the habits that liked me so much they would never let go. But he sought me out one day and said, Sar, it's mid-January, almost time for the Bon Bibi Puja. Kusum and Fakir want to go to Garjantola, and I'm going to take them there. She asked if you wanted to come. Garjantola, I said. Where is that? It is an island, he said, deep in the jungle. Kusum's father built a shrine to Bon Bibi there. That's why she wants to go. This offered a dilemma of a new kind. In the past, I had always taken care to hold myself apart from matters of religious devotion. It was not just that I thought of these beliefs as false consciousness. It was also because I had seen at first hand the horrors that religion had visited upon us at the time of partition. As headmaster, I had felt it my duty not to identify myself with any set of religious beliefs, Hindu, Muslim, or anything else. This was why, strange as it may seem, I had never seen a Bon Bibi puja, or indeed taken any interest in this deity. But I was no longer a headmaster, and the considerations that had once kept me aloof from matters were no longer applicable. But what about Nilima's injunctions? What about her plea that I stay away from Morijapi? I persuaded myself that this trip would not count as going to Morijapi, since we would, after all, be heading to another island. All right, Horan, I said, but remember not a word to Mashima. No, sir, of course, no. The next morning, Horan came at dawn and we set off. A couple of months had passed since I was last at Morichapi, and when we got there, it was clear at a glance that much had changed in the meanwhile. The euphoria of the time before had given way to fear and slow, nagging doubts. A wooden watchtower had been erected, for instance, and there were groups of settlers patrolling the island's shore. When our boat pulled in, we were immediately surrounded by several men. "Who are you?" they asked. "What's your business here?" We were a little shaken when we got to Kusum's thatched-roofed dwelling. It was clear that she too was under strain. She explained that in recent weeks the government had been stepping up the pressure on the settlers. Policemen and officials had visited and offered inducements for them to leave. When these proved ineffective, they had made threats. Although the settlers were unmoved in their resolve, a kind of nervousness had set in. No one knew what was going to happen next. The morning was quite advanced now, so we hurried on our way. Kusum and Forkir had made small clay images of Bon Bibi and her brother Shah Jongoli. These we loaded on Horan's boat and then pulled away from the island. Once we were out on the river, the tide lifted everyone's spirits. There were many other boats on the waters, all out on similar errands. Some of them had 20 or 30 people on board. Along with massive, well-painted images of Bon Bibi and Shah Jongoli, they also had singers and drummers. On our boat were just the four of us, Horan, Fokir, Kusum, and me. "Why didn't you bring your children?" I asked Horan. "What about your family?" "They went with my father-in-law and my wife's family," said Horan sheepishly. "Their boat is bigger." We came to a mahona, and as we were crossing it, I noticed that Horan and Kusum had begun to make genuflections of the kind that are usually occasioned by the sight of a deity or a temple. They raised their fingertips to their foreheads and then touched their chests. Fokir, watching attentively, attempted to do the same. "What's happening?" I asked in surprise. "What do you see? There's no temple nearby. This is just open water." Kusum laughed and at first wouldn't tell me. Then after some pleading and cajolery, she divulged that at that moment, in the very middle of that mahona, we crossed the line Bon Bibi had drawn to divide the tide country. In other words, we had crossed the border that separates the realm of human beings from the domain of Dokin Rai and his demons. I realized with a sense of shock that this chimerical line was to her and to Horan as real as a barbed wire fence might be to me. And now, indeed, everything began to look new, unexpected, full of surprises. I had a book in my hands to while away the time, and it occurred to me that, in a way, a landscape too is not unlike a book, a compilation of pages that overlap without any two ever being the same. People open the book according to their taste and training, their memories and desires. For a geologist, the compilation opens at one page, for a boatman at another, and still another for a ship's pilot, a painter, and so on. On occasion, these pages are ruled with lines that are invisible to some people, while being for others as real, as charged, and as volatile as high voltage cables. To me, a townsman, the tide country's jungle was an emptiness, a place where time stood still. I saw now that this was an illusion, that exactly the opposite was true. What was happening here, I realized, was that the wheel of time was spinning too fast to be seen. In other places, it took decades, even centuries, for a river to change course. It took an epoch for an island to appear. But here in the tide country, transformation is the rule of life. Rivers stray from week to week, and islands are made and unmade in days. In other places, forests take centuries, even millennia, to regenerate, but mangroves can recolonize a denuded island in 10 to 15 years. Could it be that the very rhythms of the earth were quickened here so that they unfolded at an accelerated pace? I remember the story of the Royal James and Mary, an English ship making its passage through the shoals of the tide country in the year 1694. Night stole unawares upon the many-masted ship, and it capsized after striking a sandbank. What would be the fate of such a shipwreck in the benign waters of the Caribbean or the Mediterranean? I imagined the thick crust of underwater life that would cling to the vessel and preserve it for centuries. I imagined the divers and explorers who would seek their fortunes in the wreck. But here, the tide country digested the great galleon within a few years. Its remains vanished without a trace. Nor was this the only such. Thinking back, I remembered that the channels of the tide country were crowded with the graves of old ships. Wasn't it true that in the great storm of 1737, more than 24 ships had foundered in these waters? And didn't it happen that in the year 1885, the British India Steam Navigation Company lost two proud steamers here, the Arcot and the Maharata? And wasn't the city of Canterbury added to that list in 1897? But today on those sides nothing is to be seen, nothing escapes the maw of the tides. Everything is ground to fine silt, becomes something else. It was as if the whole tide country were speaking in the voice of the poet. Life is lived in transformation. It is afternoon now in Morichapi, and Kusum and Horan have just returned from a meeting of the settlers of this ward. The rumors have been confirmed. The gangsters who have massed on the far shore will be brought in to drive the settlers out, but the attack, they say, will likely start tomorrow, not today. I still have a few hours left. A pilgrimage. When dinner arrived, Pia had the feeling that someone had spoken to Moina about her eating preferences. Today, apart from the usual fare of rice and fish curry, she had also brought some plain mashed potatoes and 2 bananas. Touched, Pia put her hands together in a namaste to thank Moina. Later, when Moina had gone, she asked Kanai whether it was he who had spoken to her, and he shook his head. No, it wasn't me. Must have been Fokir then. Pia served herself an eager helping of mashed potatoes. All I'm missing now is some Ovaltine. Ovaltine? Kanai looked up from his food in surprise. You like Ovaltine? He began to laugh when she nodded. Do they have Ovaltine in America? It was a habit my parents brought over, Pia said. They used to buy their stocks in Indian shops. I like it now because it's easy to carry and convenient when you're out on the water. So you live in Ovaltine while you're tracking these dolphins of yours? Sometimes. Kenai shook his head ruefully as he filled a plate with rice, dal, and chaki. You go through a lot for these creatures, don't you? That's not how I think of it. So, are they fetching these beasts of yours? Said Kanai. Do they hold one's interest? They're interesting to me, said Pia, and I can give you at least one good reason why they should be of interest to you. I'm listening, said Kanai. I'm willing to be persuaded. Why? Because some of the earliest specimens were found in Calcutta, Pia said. How's that for a reason? In Calcutta, Kanai said incredulously. You're telling me there were dolphins in Calcutta? Oh, yes, said Pia. Not just dolphins, whales too. Whales? Kanai laughed. Now I know you're pulling my leg. Not at all, said Pia. Calcutta was once a big place for cetacean zoology. I don't believe you, Kanai said flatly. I think I'd know if that were the case. But it's true, Pia said. And let me tell you, last week when I was coming through Kolkata, I actually went on a cetacean pilgrimage. And who are these Kanai burst into laughter. A cetacean pilgrimage? Yes, said Pia. My cousins laughed too, but that was just what it was, a pilgrimage. And who are these cousins of yours? Said Kanai. My Mashima's daughters, Pia said. They're younger than me, one's in high school and one's in college, both really bright, smart kids. They had a car and a driver, and they said they'd take me wherever I wanted to go in Calcutta. I guess they figured that I want to buy some souvenirs or something. When I told them where I wanted to go, they were like, the botanical gardens? What are you going to do there? I can see the point of that question, Kanai said. What do the botanical gardens have to do with dolphins? Everything, said Pia. You see, in the 19th century, the gardens were run by some very good naturalists. One of them was William Roxburgh, the man who identified the Gangetic dolphin. It was in Calcutta's botanical gardens, Pia explained, that Roxburgh had written his famous article of 1801 announcing the discovery of the first known river dolphin. He called it Delphinus gangeticus. Susu is the name it is known by amongst the Bengalese around Calcutta, but the name had been changed later when it was discovered that Pliny the Elder had already named the Indian river dolphin as far back as the 1st century CE. He called it Platanista. In the zoological inventory, the Gangetic dolphin had come to be listed as Platanista gangetica, Roxburgh 1801. Years later, John Anderson, one of Roxburgh's successors at the gardens, actually adopted an infant Gangetic dolphin. He had kept it in his bathtub and it had lived for several weeks. But you know what? Pia said. Although he had a dolphin in his bathtub, Anderson never found out that Platanista are blind or that they prefer to swim on their side. Is that what they do? Yes. So did you find the bathtub? Said Kanai, reaching across the table for the rice. Pia laughed. No, but I wasn't too disappointed. It was good just to be there. So what was the next station in your pilgrimage? Kanai said. This one will surprise you even more, said Pia. Salt Lake. Kanai's eyebrows shot up. You mean the Kolkata suburb? It wasn't always a suburb, you know, Pia said, peeling another banana. In 1852, it was just a wetland with a few scattered ponds. In July that year, Pia said, an unusually high tide caused a sudden surge in the rivers of the delta. The wave traveled deep into the hinterland, flooding the swamps and wetlands that surrounded Calcutta. When the tide turned and the waters began to recede, a rumor swept the streets of the city. A school of giant sea creatures had been stranded in one of the salt lakes on the city's western outskirts. The then superintendent of the botanical gardens was one Edward Blythe, an English naturalist. The news worried him. The year before on the Malabar coast, a stranded whale, a full 27 meters in length, had been dismembered by the local people. They had set upon it with knives, axes, and spears and hacked it apart. A nearby English clergyman was shown the meat, both dried and fresh, and was told that it was first chopped beef. What if these creatures were cut up and consumed before they had been subjected to a proper examination? The thought of this sent Blythe hurrying across the town to the Salt Lake. It wasn't that he cared about their being killed, Pia said. He just wanted to do it himself. The marshes were streaming under a blazing sun and the water had fallen back to its accustomed levels. He arrived to find some 20 animals floundering in a shallow pond. Their heads were rounded and their bodies black, with white undersides. The adult males were over 4 meters in length. The water was too low to keep them fully submerged, and their short, sharply raked dorsal fins were exposed to the sun. They were in great distress, and their moans could be clearly heard. Blythe was inclined to identify the animals as short-finned pilot whales, Globicephalus deductor. This was a common Atlantic species named and identified some 6 years before by the great British anatomist J. E. Gray. Of Gray's Anatomy? Kanai said. That's the one. A large crowd had gathered, but somewhat to Blythe's surprise they had not set upon the whales. On the contrary, many people had labored through the night to rescue the creatures, towing them through a channel into the river. Apparently these villagers had no taste for whale meat and no knowledge of the oil that could be extracted from the animals' carcasses. Blythe learned that many whales had been saved, and that the 20 remaining ones were the last of a school of several dozen. With the rescues proceeding apace, there was clearly no time to be lost. Blythe chose 2 of the best specimens and ordered his men to secure them to the bank with poles and stout ropes. His intention was to return the next day with the implements necessary for a proper dissection. But when he came back the next morning, said Pia, they were all gone. The chosen animals had been cut loose by the bystanders, but Blythe was not easily thwarted and managed to get hold of 2 of the last remaining whales. These he quickly reduced to perfect skeletons. After a prolonged examination of the bones, he decided that the animals were an unknown species. He called it the Indian pilot whale, Globicephalus indicus. I have a theory, Pia said with a smile, that if Blythe hadn't gone out to Salt Lake that day, he'd have become the man who identified the Irrawaddy dolphin. Kanai was licking a grain of rice off his forefinger. Why? Because 6 years later, he made a terrible mistake when he found the first specimen of Orcella. And where did he find it? In a Calcutta fish market, Pia said with a laugh. Someone told him about it and he went running over. He gave it a once-over and decided it was a juvenile pilot whale like the animals he'd seen out near the Salt Lake. He couldn't get those creatures out of his head. So he wasn't the one who identified your beloved dolphin? Kanai said. No, said Pia. Old Blythe missed his chance. A quarter of a century later, another carcass of a small, round-headed cetacean was found at Visakhapatnam, 650 kilometers down the coast from Calcutta. This time, the skeleton found its way to the British Museum, where it occasioned much curiosity. The anatomist of London saw that what Blythe had failed to see. This was no juvenile pilot whale. It was a new species, a relative of none other than the killer whale Orcinus orca. But where the killer whale grew to lengths of over 10 meters, its cousin rarely exceeded 2.5, while the killer whale, like the icy waters of the subpolar oceans, its cousin preferred the warmth of the tropics and appeared to thrive in both fresh water and salt. Compared to the mighty orca, this creature was so mellow as to need a diminutive. It became Orcella brevirostris to be exact. A puzzled frown appeared on Kanai's forehead. So this killer whale of yours was first netted in Calcutta and then in Visakhapatnam? Yes. Then why is it known as the Irrawaddy dolphin? That's another story, said Pia. The name was the doing of John Anderson, she said, the very one who tried to rear a gangetic dolphin in his bathtub. In the 1870s, Anderson accompanied two zoological expeditions that traveled through Burma to southern China. While sailing up the Irrawaddy, Anderson found no Orcella in the lower part of the river. In the upper reaches, on the other hand, they were present in great numbers. There appeared to be few small anatomical differences between the animals that lived in fresh water and those that lived in salt water. From this, Anderson drew the conclusion that there were two species of Orcella. To Orcella brevirostris he awarded a cousin, Orcella fluminalis. This, he decided, was the Irrawaddy dolphin, the true inhabitant of Asia's rivers. The name stuck, Pia said. But his conclusions didn't. The Great Grey of London examined several skeletons and handed down a definitive judgment. Orcella was one species, not two. It was true that there were coastal populations and riverine populations, and it was true also that the two did not mix. But anatomically there was no difference. In the Linnaean bestiary, the animal's name became Orcella brevirostris, Gray, 1886. And you know what the real irony was? Pia said. Poor old Blythe was wrong on all accounts. Not only did he blow his chances of identifying Orcella, he also misidentified the stranded whales of Calcutta's Salt Lake. They were just short-finned pilot whales. Gray showed there was no such thing as Globicephalus indicus. Kenai nodded. That's how it was in those days, he said. London was to Calcutta as Orca to Orcella. Pia laughed as she carried her plate to the sink. Are you convinced now about Calcutta being a center of cetacean zoology? Pia raised her hand to her earlobe in the gesture that Kenai had noticed before. That movement made her seem at once graceful as a dancer and as vulnerable as a child, and it made Kenai's heart stop. He could not bear to think that she would be going the next day. Leaving his plate on the table, he went to the bathroom to wash his hands. A minute later, he came hurrying out and went to stand at Pia's elbow beside the sink. I have an idea for you, Pia, he said. Yes, she said cautiously, alarmed by the shine in his eye. Do you know what your expedition lacks? What? She turned away from him, pursing her lips. A translator, Kanai said. Neither Horan nor Fakir speak English. How are you going to communicate with them? I managed okay over the last few days. But you didn't have a whole crew to deal with. She acknowledged the truth of this with a nod. She could see that there would be advantages to having him along, but her instincts told her to be careful. His presence might lead to trouble. Playing for time, she said. But don't you have stuff to do here? Not really, said Kanai. I'm getting to the end of my uncle's notebook, and it doesn't necessarily have to be read right here. I could take it with me. Frankly, I'm getting a little tired of this guest house. I wouldn't mind a little break. His eagerness was obvious, and she was aware of a twinge of guilt. There was no denying that he had been very hospitable. She would feel more at ease about staying in the guest house if she knew his generosity was not going to go unreciprocated. Well then, sure, she said after a moment's hesitation. You're welcome to come along. He made a fist and punched it into his open palm. Thank you. But this display of enthusiasm seemed to cause him some embarrassment, for he added effectively nonchalance. I've always wanted to be on an expedition. It's been an ambition of mine ever since I learned that my great-great-uncle was the translator on young husband's expedition to Tibet.